Thank you so much for that, Pastor Cody. I really appreciated it. It's such a great reminder, that we like, whenever we find security in things other than God, it's sin, right? I mean, so that's the one thing that I took from this your sermon today. It says,
I find what's sometimes hard, we can fall into I understand it, speaking of experience, we fall into a victim mentality sometimes with our problems because we realize, there's bad things that happen to us.
Yeah.
Maybe you didn't start the conflict with such and such person, or maybe, if you've been struck with, something horrible loss, like we said before, that's not your fault. And so we're very uncomfortable with then looking at our responses to things that have happened to us, things that to us seem so natural. It's hard for us sometimes to step out and realize that, that's actually not what I'm supposed to do.
yeah,
So we have to call it what it is. And look, we are all in the same boat, right?
Yeah.
So as maybe it's hard to admit about ourselves, we have to also realize that we do this as a group. We're all in the same position, and we all do the same thing. And that's what sin is.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So we don't have too many questions today, or maybe we do. I'm not sure. This text-free thing is a little bit clunky at times.
At times?
Yeah, at times. So the first question is, how does God as king differ from earthly kings? So that's referring to verses 15 through 18.
Well, we could always go back and say, well, God is a perfect king.
Yeah.
Not corrupt, not lying and deceiving and all those things. But I think what particularly, what strikes to me when we look at this is that God is really understood as in close proximity to his people, Israel. He is the direct ruler, okay? Because there is no figure who really comes between, like no one figure that comes between God and his people. There's a direct rule over them and a direct closeness. There's another word other than closeness and proximity that they have with him. You see, in the ancient Near East, your king was the intercessor.
Right.
He was the one between. Like, the gods are somewhere out there, and it's your half-god king, in some cases, who's going to, represent you on behalf, and then vice versa.
So it's like a divine mandate.
There's this distance, obviously, this lack of relationship then that the people have with their God.
Yeah.
It all goes through this king. And to me, that strikes as kind of the biggest difference. I'm sure there's definitely more, and people who study the ancient Near East and that sort of stuff would have more to say, but that's at least the kind of the shallow waters that I've waded into, and that's what I see.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, with God, you have direct access to the King of the universe instead of an intercessor.
Yeah, absolutely. The priests helped with that, obviously, with the performance of ceremonies,
Yeah.
but still, you were there, and they were like you were engaging in it. You brought the sacrifice, all that sort of stuff, So.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a couple of questions from the morning that I'd like you to answer again, maybe now that you have had a little bit more time to.
Oh no, I haven't thought of those questions. Oh my gosh. Okay.
So, if God is faithful to forgive our sins, why would God be unwilling to hear Israel if they repented of their desire to have a king? So, obviously Israel has done this sinful thing, and God is willing to forgive them of their sin, but then why does he allow them to face the consequences?
So this is a hint that apparently my answer last time was insufficient.
Or maybe I just want everybody for the second service to
No,
get it.
it's a good question. The question really happens to all of us is like, okay, I've done something wrong, and I ask for forgiveness. Okay, God forgives me. Before him, he doesn't count me as guilty. But why do I have to bear the consequences of my actions?
Yeah.
Right? That's simply it. And we ask ourselves that all the time. But then, we can think of innocuous things like, oh, maybe I, whatever. I stressed out too much because I had a bad grade, and now I skipped out on the family dinner to study harder or something like that. Think something small. But then say, well, would it be fair if I killed somebody and I got forgiven by God that he would also wipe away the consequences of me killing somebody? Or I'll go to the other extreme just to point it out, and we can go work our way down the middle. Really, if we don't have the consequences for our actions, we have two problems. One, there is no justice in human terms or before God. We've done something wrong, and there is a right to have a certain penalty that goes along with that when we do wrong things. But also it goes back to the second thing, that we won't learn otherwise. We won't learn how sinful sin really is, how sinful we are, all the ways in which we do bad things. We won't recognize it. We won't really learn it if we don't actually deal
Yeah,
with the consequences, which consequences really is what tells us and communicates to us when we've done something wrong,
Yeah.
right? Like, I mean, if I steal something and have consequences, well, you know, if I don't have someone telling me it's bad, I can just do it again, right? The other thing then is that we also recognize how good God is. It's just this reminder, this moral reminder of how we're supposed to act,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, I guess the third thing as well that I may add is it's a reminder that, like you said, it ties in with God's goodness, how eternal the consequences could have been, right? This temporary, the fact that you'll have to go to prison, for example, it's a reminder that there is a much greater consequence that you're saved from because God has forgiven you. If you get
I like
my-
that. Yeah. I mean, you're no longer judged by God eternally,
Yeah.
and so we can look at the present consequences and realize also, thankfully, it's not much worse.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And a third and final question. Again, this is a repeat from the morning, but I just so love the answer that you gave. So, in the law, there are a set of commands for this, for the king, right? Like there's a few rules. So, knowing that God foresaw the need for a king, were the people of Israel's demand for a king, was it like sinful in and of itself, or maybe was it the reasoning behind it? That's what was sinful.
Right. Yeah, I remember this question. So basically, the questioner is right by saying, God foresaw, I think it says the need for a king, but God foresaw that there would come a time when Israel would have a king, right? And so that's where we understand that God is all-knowing. He knows everything that's going to happen down the road. He has a plan. That's another thing we affirm, that God has, his will be done, and since he has a plan to bring us along, it's called providence, another word we use for it, right? But we also understand that within that, we have the freedom to disobey God. We are able to disobey him. We are able to go astray, right? So he works within that. He works within that. So I don't really, and a lot of commentators would pull this point, which I think this is correct. He's not necessarily looking forward and saying, there will come a time when Israel needs a king. He's looking forward to a time and saying, I see a time when Israel is now going to go astray. Many times in idolatry, and at this point, at one juncture, they will go and say, we also want to reject your system of government for our own, which is very normal because, they're surrounded by kingdoms, just like they adopt the religions of their neighbors often and the customs of their neighbors. It's not surprising they would also bring on and adopt the political institutions, right? So he foresees that this will happen.
Yeah.
But yes, in his law, makes provision for that, knowing that their sin will come and lead them in this direction.
Right.
Rather than seeing a need for it and saying, okay, it's going to happen in the future. So that being said, I would say that they are in sin by rejecting God's design for their governance and their system, rather than the emotions behind it. Though the emotion behind it, the intention behind it is also sinful.
Yeah.
It's on both counts.
Yeah. Well, that's all the questions that we have today. If you have any questions, we love them here at Voyage, especially when I'm not the preacher. And you can text them to our number 438-899-0858, or you can text me, Ben, or Pastor Cody, and we'd be happy to try to answer them as best as we can. And
yeah, for sure. And if anyone ever wants to talk more about any of the questions you hear, if you didn't ask them, you're like, hey, that's curious, or you have a backup question or something, we can talk about it. If you want into more detail, I'd be happy to sit down when I get a chance to do some more research in it as well. If it's not my area of expertise, that would be, we're definitely here for that too.